In the heart of West Africa, where the Sahara Desert meets the fertile grasslands of the Sudan, there once stood an empire so wealthy that its very name became synonymous with gold. This was Ghana, the first great empire of medieval Africa, a civilization that controlled the flow of precious metals and salt across the vast expanse of the Sahara for over 5 centuries. But here's what's fascinating. When we think of medieval empires, our minds often drift to the castles of Europe or the dynasties of China. Yet while Vikings were raiding coastal villages and Charlemagne was being crowned emperor of the Romans, there was already a sophisticated African empire that had been thriving for centuries, one that would make European kings look like paupers in comparison. The story you're about to hear isn't just about an ancient kingdom that disappeared into the sands of time. It's about how a small collection of farming communities transformed themselves into the masters of international trade, how they built cities that dazzled foreign visitors, and how their influence shaped the development of an entire continent. This is the story of Ghana, the land of gold, and tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll journey through the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Picture this. It's the year 800 CE. In Europe, peasants are struggling through what historians call the Dark Ages. Most people can't read, cities are small and dirty, and international trade barely exists. But if you could somehow transport yourself to West Africa at this same moment, you'd witness something extraordinary. Vast caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, crossing the seemingly endless Sahara Desert loaded down with precious cargo. Gold flowing north, salt flowing south, and at the center of it all, controlling every transaction, taxing every trader, growing wealthy beyond imagination, was the Empire of Ghana. The Ghana Empire didn't emerge overnight from nothing. Its foundations were laid centuries earlier by the Soninka people, who had been living in the region between the Senegal and Niger rivers since ancient times. These weren't nomadic wanderers scraping out a basic existence. The Soninka were sophisticated farmers, iron workers, and traders who understood something that would make them incredibly powerful. They lived at the perfect geographic crossroads. To the north lay the Sahara Desert, that vast sea of sand that separated North Africa from the rest of the continent. To the south stretched the fertile Sudan, rich in gold deposits and agricultural land. The Soninka realized that whoever controlled the routes between these two regions could become wealthy beyond measure. But it would take centuries of careful political maneuvering, military conquest, and economic development before this potential became reality. The word Ghana itself meant war chief in the Soninka language, and it was originally just the title given to the ruler of a small kingdom centered around the town of Koumbi Saleh. But as this kingdom grew in power and influence, the name Ghana came to represent not just the ruler, but the entire empire he controlled. Arab chroniclers and traders, who were some of the first outsiders to write about this distant land, began using Ghana to describe the whole region, and the name stuck. What made Ghana's rise possible was a revolution in transportation technology that most people have never heard of. Around the 3rd century CE, camels were introduced to the Sahara Desert from the Middle East. This might not sound like a big deal, but it completely transformed African trade. Before camels, crossing the Sahara was nearly impossible. The desert was too vast, too hot, and too dangerous for horses or donkeys to traverse safely with heavy loads. But camels were different. These remarkable animals could travel for days without water, carry enormous loads, and navigate the treacherous sand dunes that had previously made the Sahara an impenetrable barrier. Suddenly, for the first time in history, regular trade between North Africa and the lands south of the Sahara became not just possible, but profitable. The people who would later form the Ghana Empire were among the first to recognize the incredible potential of this new situation. They began organizing and protecting the trade routes that crossed their territory. They established way stations where caravans could rest and resupply. Most importantly, they imposed taxes on all goods that passed through their lands, taking a percentage of every transaction in exchange for safe passage and protection from bandits. But Ghana's wealth wasn't built on trade alone. The empire sat on top of some of the richest gold deposits in the world. In the forest regions to the south of Ghana's core territory, particularly in the area known as Bambuk, gold could literally be picked up from riverbeds and extracted from shallow mines. This wasn't the deep industrial mining that we think of today. Much of Ghana's gold came from simple panning operations, where local people would sift through river sediment to find nuggets and gold dust. The Ghana Empire established a monopoly over this gold trade through a combination of military force, political alliances, and economic incentives. Local gold-producing communities were either conquered and incorporated into the empire, or they formed tributary relationships where they agreed to sell their gold exclusively to Ghana in exchange for protection and access to trade goods from the north. What's remarkable is how the rulers of Ghana managed to maintain control over this gold trade for centuries. They understood that scarcity created value, so they carefully regulated how much gold entered the market. Too little, and prices would be so high that trade would dry up. Too much, and prices would collapse, reducing their profits. The Ghana Empire became master economists, manipulating supply and demand across an international market that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. The other crucial commodity that made Ghana wealthy was salt. This might seem strange to us today, when salt is so cheap and common that we barely think about it. But in medieval times, salt was literally worth its weight in gold. It was essential for preserving food, especially meat, in an age before refrigeration. It was also necessary for human health, particularly in hot climates where people lost salt through sweating. The problem was that while gold was abundant in the forest regions of West Africa, salt was scarce. The nearest major salt deposits were hundreds of miles to the north, in places like the mines of Taghaza in the middle of the Sahara Desert. These salt mines were brutal places to work, essentially slave labor camps where workers extracted salt under horrific conditions. But the salt they produced was pure and white, highly prized throughout West Africa. Ghana positioned itself as the middleman in this trade. Northern merchants would bring salt south, while southern merchants would bring gold north, and Ghana would tax both transactions. The empire's rulers grew so wealthy from these taxes that they could afford to maintain large armies, build impressive cities, and live in luxury that amazed foreign visitors. The capital city of Ghana, known as Koumbi Saleh, became one of the largest cities in the world during its peak. Archaeological evidence suggests it may have housed over 30,000 people, making it larger than most European cities of the same period. The city was actually divided into two sections connected by a road about 6 miles long. One section, built around wells and fertile land, housed the majority of the population, including merchants, craftsmen, and traders from across Africa and the Middle East. The other section, built on higher ground, contained the royal palace and was home to the emperor and his court. Arab chroniclers who visited Ghana during its golden age left us detailed descriptions of the wealth and power they witnessed. Al-Bakri, an 11th century geographer from Spain, never actually visited Ghana himself, but he collected accounts from merchants and travelers who had been there. According to his sources, the Emperor of Ghana could field an army of 200,000 men, including 40,000 archers. This was an enormous military force for the time period, larger than most European armies. The emperor's court was described as a place of incredible luxury and ceremony. The ruler wore fine clothing, gold jewelry, and was surrounded by officials and guards. When he held court, he would sit in a pavilion decorated with gold and silver, and people would approach him by crawling on their bellies and throwing dust on their heads as a sign of respect. This wasn't just political theater. These ceremonies were designed to project power and wealth, to demonstrate to both subjects and foreign visitors that Ghana was a force to be respected and feared. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Ghana's government was its administrative system. Running an empire that stretched across hundreds of thousands of square miles, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups and languages, required sophisticated bureaucracy. The Ghana Empire developed a system of provincial governors who were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and reporting back to the central government. These governors were often members of local ruling families who had been incorporated into the empire's power structure, creating a web of personal loyalty and political obligation that held the empire together. The military might of Ghana was legendary throughout West Africa. The empire's armies were well-equipped, well-trained, and highly mobile. They used iron weapons at a time when many of their enemies were still fighting with bronze or stone tools. They had cavalry units mounted on horses, which gave them a significant advantage in open terrain. Most importantly, they had the wealth to maintain these forces year-round, rather than relying on seasonal levies of farmers who had to return to their fields. Ghana's military strategy wasn't just about conquest, though the empire certainly expanded its territory through warfare. It was also about protection. The wealth that flowed through Ghana's trade routes made the empire a tempting target for raiders and rival powers. The Ghana Empire's military served as a security force, protecting caravans, maintaining order in markets, and deterring attacks from neighboring kingdoms. The religious landscape of Ghana was complex and diverse, reflecting the empire's position at the crossroads of different cultures and trade networks. The original Soninke population followed traditional African religions, worshipping ancestors and nature spirits. The royal family and much of the court remained committed to these traditional beliefs throughout most of Ghana's history. However, as trade with North Africa intensified, Islam began to spread into Ghana, particularly among the merchant class. Muslim traders found it advantageous to convert to Islam because it connected them to a vast commercial network that stretched across the Islamic world. Islamic law provided standardized contracts and dispute resolution mechanisms that made long-distance trade more secure and predictable. The rulers of Ghana adopted a pragmatic approach to this religious diversity. They welcomed Muslim merchants and even employed Muslim advisors and administrators, but they maintained their traditional religious practices. This religious tolerance was partly political calculation and partly necessity. Ghana's wealth depended on maintaining good relationships with both Islamic North Africa and the traditional societies of sub-Saharan Africa. The Ghana Empire's influence extended far beyond its borders through a combination of military power, economic relationships, and cultural exchange. Neighboring kingdoms either became vassals of Ghana, paying tribute in exchange for protection, or they formed alliances to share in the benefits of Ghana's trade networks. The empire's currency, which included gold dust, salt bars, and cowrie shells, became accepted across a vast region of West Africa. Ghana's cultural influence spread along with its traders and administrators. The Soninke language became a lingua franca across much of the western Sudan, allowing people from different ethnic groups to communicate and conduct business. Ghana's artistic traditions, particularly metalworking and textile production, influenced craftsmen across West Africa. The empire's political institutions served as models for later kingdoms that would emerge in the region. The daily life of ordinary people within the Ghana Empire varied dramatically depending on their social status and occupation. At the top of society stood the emperor and his immediate family, who lived in luxury that would have impressed European royalty. The royal compound in Koumbi Saleh contained multiple buildings constructed from stone and decorated with intricate carvings. The emperor's personal quarters were furnished with silk cushions, ivory ornaments, and golden vessels imported from across the known world. Below the royal family came the noble class, which included provincial governors, military commanders, and wealthy merchants. These individuals owned large houses, maintained private armies of retainers, and participated in the empire's lucrative trade networks. Many nobles owned slaves, who performed domestic labor and worked in agricultural production. The noble lifestyle was comfortable and secure, with access to imported luxuries and local specialties. The merchant class formed the backbone of Ghana's economy. These traders, many of whom were Muslim, traveled vast distances carrying goods between different regions. They lived in special quarters of major cities, organized into communities based on their ethnic origins and religious affiliations. Successful merchants could accumulate enormous wealth, sometimes rivaling that of minor nobles. They invested their profits in trade expeditions, real estate, and luxury goods. Craftsmen and artisans occupied a respected position in Ghana society. Blacksmiths held particularly high status because of their ability to work with iron, a skill that was both economically valuable and spiritually significant in many West African cultures. Goldsmiths, textile workers, leather workers, and potters all contributed to the empire's economic prosperity while creating goods that were traded across Africa and beyond. The vast majority of Ghana's population consisted of farmers who grew the food that fed the empire. Most of these agricultural workers lived in small villages scattered across the countryside. They grew millet, sorghum, rice, and other crops suited to the West African climate. Some farmers specialized in cotton production, which supported the empire's thriving textile industry. Others raised cattle, goats, and sheep, providing meat, milk, and leather for local consumption and trade. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, who performed much of the manual labor that kept the empire functioning. Slavery in medieval Ghana was different from the plantation slavery that would later develop in the Americas. Many slaves were prisoners of war, or people who had been sold into slavery to pay off debts. Some slaves could earn their freedom through loyal service, and the children of slaves were sometimes adopted into their masters' families. The educational system in Ghana reflected the empire's diverse cultural influences. Traditional education focused on practical skills, oral history, and religious knowledge passed down through family lines and community elders. Young people learned farming techniques, craft skills, and the complex social customs that governed daily life. Griots, professional storytellers, and musicians preserved historical knowledge and cultural traditions through elaborate performances that could last for days. Islamic education became increasingly important as the empire's connections with the Muslim world deepened. Madrasas, Islamic schools, were established in major cities where students learned to read Arabic and studied the Quran, Islamic law, and various academic subjects. These schools produced the literate administrators and merchants who facilitated Ghana's international trade relationships. Women in Ghana society occupied complex positions that varied according to their social class and family circumstances. Elite women, particularly those connected to the royal family, could wield considerable political influence. Some served as advisors to rulers or managed important trade relationships. Queen mothers held special ceremonial roles and were often consulted on matters of succession and governance. Ordinary women worked alongside men in agricultural production and participated in local trade networks. They often specialized in particular crafts such as pottery, textile production, or food preparation. In market towns, women frequently operated small businesses, selling agricultural products, prepared foods, and handmade goods. The market women of Ghana's cities formed powerful networks that could influence local politics and economic decisions. Marriage customs in Ghana reflected the empire's stratified social structure. Elite families arranged marriages to strengthen political alliances and consolidate wealth. These unions often involved elaborate ceremonies and substantial bride prices paid in gold, livestock, or trade goods. Polygamy was common among wealthy men, who could afford to support multiple wives and their children. For ordinary people, marriage was typically a more modest affair, though still governed by complex social customs and obligations. Extended families played important roles in arranging matches and providing support for new couples. The payment of bride price, even in reduced amounts, remained an important symbol of respect and commitment. Religious festivals and ceremonies marked the passage of time in Ghana society. Traditional celebrations honored ancestors, marked agricultural seasons, and celebrated important life events such as births, marriages, and coming-of-age rituals. These festivals often involved elaborate performances, communal feasting, and the distribution of gifts that reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. Islamic holidays gradually became part of the cultural calendar, particularly in urban areas with significant Muslim populations. The celebration of Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha brought together diverse communities and provided opportunities for rulers to demonstrate their wealth and generosity through public festivities and charitable giving. The arts flourished under Ghana's prosperous and stable government. Sculptors working in wood, ivory, and bronze created religious objects, ceremonial items, and decorative pieces that reflected both local traditions and foreign influences. The empire's metalworkers were renowned throughout West Africa for their skill in working with gold, silver, copper, and iron. Music and dance played central roles in Ghana's cultural life. Professional musicians performed at royal courts, religious ceremonies, and public festivals. The development of sophisticated musical instruments, including drums, stringed instruments, and wind instruments, created rich soundscapes that accompanied both sacred and secular events. Textile production reached remarkable levels of sophistication during Ghana's Golden Age. Weavers created complex patterns using locally grown cotton and imported silk threads. They developed distinctive dyeing techniques using local plants and minerals that produced vibrant colors. Ghana's textiles became valuable trade goods, exported across the Sahara and prized in North African markets. The architectural achievements of the Ghana Empire reflected both practical needs and aesthetic ambitions. The capital city of Koumbi Saleh featured impressive stone buildings, including the Royal Palace Complex, major mosques, and wealthy merchants' houses. These structures incorporated both local building traditions and architectural elements learned from North African and Middle Eastern visitors. Smaller towns throughout the empire developed their own architectural styles, adapted to local conditions and available materials. Most buildings were constructed from adobe brick or stone, with flat roofs suitable for the region's climate. Public buildings such as markets, mosques, and administrative centers often featured decorative elements that showcased local craftsmanship. The legal system that governed Ghana combined traditional African law with Islamic legal principles. Local disputes were typically handled by community elders who applied customary law based on precedent and social consensus. More serious cases, particularly those involving trade disputes or criminal offenses, might be referred to royal courts, where professional judges applied a mixture of traditional and Islamic legal principles. The empire's commercial law was particularly sophisticated, reflecting the complexity of Ghana's international trade relationships. Standard contracts governed various types of business transactions, including caravan expeditions, mining operations, and agricultural ventures. Dispute resolution mechanisms provided ways to handle conflicts between traders from different cultural backgrounds and legal traditions. Ghana's agricultural systems supported the empire's large population through intensive farming techniques adapted to West African conditions. Farmers developed sophisticated irrigation systems that maximized the use of available water sources. They practiced crop rotation and intercropping methods that maintained soil fertility while producing diverse foods. The empire's agricultural surplus allowed for the specialization of labor that characterizes advanced civilizations. Not everyone needed to produce food, which freed people to pursue other occupations such as craftsmanship, trade, administration, and military service. This economic foundation made possible the cultural achievements and political stability that defined Ghana's golden age. Transportation networks throughout the empire facilitated both military control and economic development. Well-maintained roads connected major cities and allowed for the rapid movement of armies, administrators, and trade goods. River transport along the Senegal and Niger rivers provided additional transportation capacity for bulk goods, such as grain and building materials. The empire maintained a sophisticated communication system that allowed the central government to stay in contact with distant provinces. Professional messengers carried official correspondence along established routes, while merchants and travelers provided informal channels for the exchange of news and information. As Ghana reached the height of its power and prosperity in the 10th and 11th centuries, few could have predicted that this mighty empire was approaching a period of decline that would ultimately lead to its fragmentation and fall. The very success that had made Ghana wealthy and powerful contained the seeds of its eventual downfall, as changing trade patterns, religious conflicts, and external pressures began to challenge the foundations of imperial authority. The prosperity that had made Ghana the wonder of medieval Africa was built on a delicate balance of power, economics, and diplomacy that required constant maintenance. Like a master juggler keeping multiple objects in the air, the rulers of Ghana had to manage competing interests, shifting alliances, and evolving circumstances that could threaten their empire's stability at any moment. By the 11th century, the first cracks were beginning to show in the foundation of Ghana's dominance. The empire had grown so large and complex that governing it effectively was becoming increasingly difficult. Provincial governors, once loyal servants of the central authority, began to develop their own power bases and independent interests. Some started keeping larger portions of the taxes they collected, claiming they needed the resources to deal with local threats and challenges. The distances involved in governing such a vast empire created inevitable communication delays that ambitious regional leaders could exploit. A message from the capital might take weeks or even months to reach distant provinces, and by the time a response arrived, local situations could have changed dramatically. This lag in communication gave provincial administrators opportunities to make decisions that served their own interests, rather than those of the empire as a whole. Religious tensions also began to complicate Ghana's internal politics in ways that previous generations of rulers had managed to avoid. As Islam spread more widely throughout the empire, particularly among the urban merchant classes, traditional religious authorities felt their influence declining. Some nobles who had converted to Islam began to question why they should be ruled by emperors who followed traditional African religions. Meanwhile, traditionalists worried that Islamic influences were undermining the cultural foundations of Ghana's power. These religious divisions were more than just theological disagreements. They reflected deeper questions about identity, loyalty, and political legitimacy that struck at the heart of how the empire was organized. The careful religious tolerance that had once been one of Ghana's greatest strengths was becoming a source of internal friction as different groups began to see their interests as incompatible. External pressures were mounting as well. To the north, the Almoravid movement was gaining strength in Morocco and Algeria. These were Islamic reformers who believed in spreading their faith through military conquest and who viewed the religious tolerance of empires like Ghana as weakness rather than wisdom. The Almoravids had already begun expanding southward into the Sahara, taking control of key trade routes and oases that Ghana had previously dominated. The Almoravid expansion posed both military and economic threats to Ghana. Militarily, these Islamic warriors were well organized, highly motivated, and equipped with superior weapons and tactics learned from campaigns in North Africa and Spain. Economically, their control over northern trade routes meant that Ghana could no longer guarantee safe passage for merchants, which undermined one of the empire's most important sources of revenue. But perhaps the most serious challenge facing Ghana was the gradual shift in trade patterns that was reducing the empire's economic advantages. New trade routes were developing that bypassed Ghana's traditional strongholds. Some merchants began using eastern routes that went through Kanem-Bornu and other emerging powers, while others found ways to trade directly with gold-producing regions without going through Ghana's middlemen. The empire's monopoly over the gold trade was also being challenged by the development of new mining areas that lay outside Ghana's control. As word spread about the wealth to be found in West African goldfields, more traders and entrepreneurs were willing to take risks to access these resources directly, rather than paying Ghana's taxes and fees. Climate change added another layer of difficulty to Ghana's challenges. The Sahara Desert was gradually expanding southward, making some previously fertile areas less productive and forcing populations to migrate. This environmental shift disrupted established settlement patterns and trade routes, while creating refugee populations that strained the empire's resources. The changing climate also affected the delicate balance of pastoralism and agriculture that sustained much of Ghana's population. Herders found themselves competing with farmers for increasingly scarce water and grazing land, leading to conflicts that required imperial intervention and resources to resolve. These various pressures created a cascade of problems that fed on each other and made the empire's situation progressively worse. Reduced trade revenues meant less money available for maintaining the military forces needed to protect the remaining trade routes. Weakened military capacity made it harder to control rebellious provinces and collect taxes. Lower tax revenues further reduced the empire's ability to project power and maintain order. The psychological impact of these setbacks was perhaps as damaging as their practical effects. For centuries, Ghana had projected an image of invincible power and unlimited wealth that had deterred potential enemies and impressed potential allies. As word spread that the empire was facing difficulties, this reputation for strength began to crumble, encouraging more challenges and making it harder to resolve conflicts through diplomacy rather than force. Some historians point to specific events that marked turning points in Ghana's decline, though it's important to remember that the empire's fall was a gradual process rather than a sudden collapse. The Almoravid conquest of Ouagadougou in 1054 was certainly a significant blow, as this city had been one of Ghana's most important northern trading posts and a symbol of the empire's reach. The loss of Ouagadougou demonstrated that Ghana could no longer protect its most valuable assets and encouraged other enemies to test the empire's defenses. It also cut off important revenue streams just when the empire needed resources most to deal with its mounting challenges. Around the same time, Ghana was dealing with succession disputes that further weakened central authority. The death of a strong emperor often triggered competition between potential heirs, and these internal power struggles diverted attention and resources away from external threats. Provincial governors might support different candidates, effectively turning the empire's administrative structure into competing factions. The Almoravids took advantage of Ghana's internal divisions to launch more aggressive attacks on the empire's heartland. In 1076, Almoravid forces captured Koumbi Saleh itself, though they were unable to hold the city permanently. This raid was devastating both materially and symbolically. The sack of the capital showed that even Ghana's core territories were vulnerable to attack, while the destruction of property and displacement of population disrupted the economic networks that sustained imperial power. The brief Almoravid occupation of Koumbi Saleh also accelerated the religious and cultural changes that were already transforming Ghana's society. The conquerors imposed Islamic law and customs on the city's population, forcing conversions and destroying traditional religious sites. While many of these changes were reversed when Ghana regained control of its capital, the psychological impact lingered. However, it would be wrong to attribute Ghana's decline solely to external conquest. The empire was already weakening from internal problems when the Almoravids struck, and their attacks were as much a symptom of Ghana's vulnerability as a cause of its fall. A stronger, more unified Ghana might have repelled these invasions just as it had defeated earlier enemies. The most fundamental problem facing Ghana was that the world was changing in ways that made the empire's traditional advantages less valuable. The monopoly over trans-Saharan trade that had been the foundation of Ghana's wealth was being undermined by new technologies, new routes, and new competitors. The political and military strategies that had worked for centuries were becoming obsolete in the face of new threats and challenges. As the 12th century progressed, Ghana found itself caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The empire still controlled significant territory and resources, but its power was clearly waning. Provincial governors increasingly acted as independent rulers, maintaining only nominal allegiance to the central government. Trade revenues continued to decline as merchants found alternative routes and partners. The imperial court tried various strategies to reverse this decline. Some emperors attempted military campaigns to reconquer lost territories and reassert Ghana's dominance. Others focused on diplomatic efforts, trying to negotiate new trade agreements and political alliances that might restore the empire's economic advantages. Still others embraced religious and cultural changes, hoping that conversion to Islam might improve relations with northern trading partners and the Almoravid states. None of these approaches proved successful in the long term. Military campaigns were expensive and often unsuccessful, draining resources that might have been better used for economic development or diplomatic initiatives. Diplomatic efforts foundered on the reality that Ghana no longer had the leverage to negotiate from a position of strength. Religious conversion alienated traditional supporters without necessarily winning over new allies who remained suspicious of Ghana's motives and capabilities. The fragmentation of the Ghana Empire was not a single dramatic event, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over several decades. Different regions broke away at different times and for different reasons. Some provinces declared independence and established their own kingdoms. Others were conquered by expanding neighbors who took advantage of Ghana's weakness. Still others simply ceased to acknowledge imperial authority and began governing themselves without formal declarations of independence. This fragmentation created a complex political landscape in West Africa, where former provinces of Ghana became independent kingdoms, competing with each other and with other emerging powers for control over trade routes and resources. Some of these successor states, such as the kingdoms of Soso and the early Mali Empire, would eventually become significant powers in their own right. The rise of the Soso kingdom under Sumanguru represents one of the most important developments in the post-Ghana period. Sumanguru was a skilled military leader who conquered much of Ghana's former territory and attempted to recreate the empire under his own rule. For a time, it seemed possible that Soso might succeed in reuniting the fragmented region under a new dynasty. However, Sumanguru's harsh rule and his conflicts with traditional religious authorities created opposition that ultimately led to his downfall. The famous epic of Sundiata tells the story of how this legendary hero defeated Sumanguru and founded the Mali Empire. Though historians debate how much of this epic represents historical fact versus mythological storytelling. What is clear is that by the early 13th century, the Ghana Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. The name Ghana survived in some contexts, and small kingdoms claiming descent from the original empire continued to exist in parts of the former imperial territory. But the great empire that had once controlled the flow of gold and salt across West Africa was now just a memory preserved in the stories told by griots and the accounts written by Arab chroniclers. The fall of Ghana marked the end of an era in West African history, but it also represented a transition to new forms of political organization and economic activity. The collapse of imperial authority created opportunities for local communities to develop their own institutions, and for new leaders to emerge who would eventually build different but equally impressive civilizations. The legacy of Ghana would live on in the empires that succeeded it, particularly Mali and Songhai, which built upon the foundations laid by Ghana's rulers and merchants. The trade networks, urban centers, and cultural traditions developed during Ghana's Golden Age provided the infrastructure and knowledge that made later West African empires possible. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the vast caravans still crossing the desert sands, the echoes of a once mighty empire lingering in the wind, and the golden threads of commerce and culture that Ghana wove into the fabric of African civilization. The empire may have fallen, but its story continues to resonate across the centuries, reminding us of the remarkable achievements possible when human ingenuity, natural resources, and favorable circumstances combine to create something truly extraordinary. The story of Ghana's decline wasn't just about military defeats or economic pressures. It was about something more fundamental, something that strikes at the heart of every great civilization that has ever risen and fallen. It was about the challenge of maintaining unity across vast distances, diverse peoples, and competing interests when the very success that built your power begins to work against you. As Ghana's influence waned, a new generation of leaders emerged throughout West Africa who had grown up watching the empire's struggles. These were men and women who understood that the old ways of doing things might not work in a changing world. They had witnessed Ghana's glory, but they had also seen its limitations. Most importantly, they had learned from both its successes and its failures. Among these emerging leaders was a young prince whose story would become the stuff of legend. His name was Sundiata Keita, and he would go on to found the Mali Empire, which would eventually surpass even Ghana in size, wealth, and international influence. But Sundiata's rise to power was anything but certain, and his early life was marked by hardship and exile that would have broken a lesser man. According to the great oral epic that bears his name, Sundiata was born into the royal family of a small kingdom that was struggling under the oppressive rule of Sumanguru, the king of Soso, who had conquered much of Ghana's former territory. The epic tells us that Sundiata was born with a physical disability that made it impossible for him to walk normally, leading many to dismiss him as a potential leader. His own father died when Sundiata was still young, and political rivals forced him and his mother into exile. For years, Sundiata lived as a refugee, moving from court to court, dependent on the charity of distant relatives and foreign rulers. This experience of powerlessness and displacement gave him a unique perspective on leadership and governance that would later influence how he built his own empire. He learned what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be at the mercy of others' decisions, to watch injustice unfold without having the power to stop it. But exile also gave Sundiata opportunities that he might never have had if he had remained in his homeland. He traveled widely throughout West Africa, learning about different cultures, political systems, and military techniques. He formed alliances with other exiled princes and displaced nobles who shared his desire to challenge Sumanguru's dominance. Most importantly, he developed the diplomatic and leadership skills that would eventually enable him to unite a diverse coalition against the Soso king. The Epic of Sundiata tells us that he eventually overcame his physical disabilities through determination and spiritual intervention. Whether this transformation was literal or metaphorical, it clearly represents his evolution from a powerless exile into a charismatic leader capable of inspiring others to follow him into battle against seemingly impossible odds. The turning point came when Sundiata and his allies decided that they could no longer tolerate Sumanguru's harsh rule. The Soso king had made too many enemies through his cruelty and arrogance. He had alienated traditional religious authorities by trying to suppress ancient customs and beliefs. He had imposed heavy taxes that impoverished local communities. Most dangerously, he had failed to maintain the delicate balance of interests that was necessary to govern such a diverse region successfully. Sundiata's coalition represented something new in West African politics. Unlike previous conquerors who had relied primarily on military force and the support of their own ethnic groups, Sundiata built his movement around shared grievances and common interests that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. His army included Mandinka warriors from his own people, but it also incorporated fighters from many other groups who had suffered under Soso rule. The decisive battle between Sundiata and Sumanguru took place at Kirina around 1235 CE. The epic describes this confrontation in mythological terms, with both leaders using magical powers and supernatural allies to gain advantage over their enemies. While we can't take these supernatural elements literally, they reflect the very real sense that this battle would determine the future of West Africa. Sundiata's victory at Kirina was more than just a military triumph. It represented the triumph of a new approach to governance that would shape West African politics for centuries to come. Rather than simply replacing one autocratic ruler with another, Sundiata established a political system that recognized the rights and interests of different groups within his expanding territory. The Mali Empire that emerged from Sundiata's conquests was built on foundations that Ghana had established, but it was also something genuinely new. Mali controlled the same basic trade routes that had made Ghana wealthy, but it expanded them to cover a much larger area. Mali's merchants traded not just across the Sahara, but also along the Atlantic coast and deep into the forest regions of West and Central Africa. Mali also inherited Ghana's role as a mediator between different religious and cultural traditions, but it handled this challenge more successfully. The Mali rulers converted to Islam relatively early in the empire's history, which gave them credibility with North African trading partners and access to the broader Islamic world. However, they maintained tolerant policies toward traditional African religions and allowed local communities to preserve their customary practices. This religious flexibility was crucial to Mali's success because the empire was even more diverse than Ghana had been. Mali stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions. Managing this diversity required sophisticated diplomatic skills and a willingness to compromise that not all rulers possessed. The most famous ruler of Mali was Mansa Musa, who reigned during the early 14th century when the empire was at the height of its power and wealth. Mansa Musa's name became synonymous with unimaginable riches, and his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324-1325 made Mali famous throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage reveals both the incredible wealth of Mali and the sophisticated international connections that the empire maintained. When Mansa Musa traveled to Mecca, he didn't go alone. His caravan included thousands of followers, hundreds of camels loaded with trade goods, and so much gold that his generous spending in Cairo and other cities along the route actually caused inflation that lasted for years. This wasn't just showing off, though Mansa Musa certainly enjoyed displaying his wealth and power. The pilgrimage served important diplomatic and economic purposes. It announced to the Islamic world that Mali was a major power that deserved respect and recognition. It established trade relationships and diplomatic contacts that would benefit Mali for generations. It also demonstrated Mansa Musa's religious devotion, which enhanced his legitimacy both at home and abroad. But perhaps most importantly, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage put Mali on the map, literally. Medieval mapmakers began including Mali in their world maps, often depicting Mansa Musa as a powerful king holding a golden orb or nugget. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, one of the most famous medieval maps, shows Mansa Musa seated on a throne in West Africa with the caption, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country, that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." Mali's wealth, like Ghana's before it, was built primarily on control of the gold trade. But Mali's gold resources were even more extensive than Ghana's had been. The empire controlled the gold fields of Bambouk that Ghana had dominated, but it also gained access to new sources of gold in Bure and other regions. These gold fields were incredibly productive, and Mali's rulers carefully managed their exploitation to maximize both production and profits. The salt trade remained equally important to Mali's economy. The empire controlled the same salt mines in the Sahara that had enriched Ghana, but Mali also developed new sources of salt and expanded trade networks to reach new markets. The city of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara Desert, became one of the most important salt-producing centers in the world under Mali's control. But Mali's economy was more diversified than Ghana's had been. The empire's merchants traded in copper from mines in the Sahara, ivory from elephant herds in the southern forests, and slaves captured in wars or purchased from neighboring kingdoms. Mali also developed significant agricultural production, with the fertile Niger River Valley providing food not just for local consumption, but for export to less productive regions. The capital city of Mali, known as Niani, became one of the great urban centers of the medieval world. Located on the Niger River, Niani served as the political, economic, and cultural heart of the empire. The city's markets attracted merchants from across Africa and the Middle East, while its mosques and schools made it an important center of Islamic learning. Niani's royal palace complex was described by visitors as a marvel of architecture and decoration. The palace buildings were constructed from local stone and decorated with intricate carvings and metalwork. The throne room could accommodate thousands of visitors during public ceremonies, while private quarters housed the emperor's family and closest advisors in luxury that rivaled the courts of Europe and Asia. The administrative system that governed Mali was more sophisticated than anything Ghana had developed. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an appointed official who reported directly to the emperor. These provincial governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and implementing imperial policies within their territories. Below the provincial level, Mali incorporated existing local authority structures rather than trying to replace them entirely. Traditional chiefs and community leaders retained significant autonomy as long as they acknowledged Mali's supremacy and fulfilled their obligations to the imperial government. This flexible approach to governance allowed Mali to expand rapidly while minimizing resistance from conquered populations. Mali's military was the largest and most professional force that West Africa had ever seen. The empire could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, including cavalry units, infantry formations, and specialized troops trained for different types of warfare. Mali's soldiers were equipped with iron weapons, chainmail armor, and shields that made them formidable opponents in battle. But Mali's military strength wasn't just about numbers and equipment. The empire's armies were well organized, well supplied, and highly disciplined. They had professional officers who understood tactics and strategy, logistical systems that could support long campaigns, and intelligence networks that provided information about enemy movements and capabilities. Mali also maintained a powerful navy that controlled traffic along the Niger River and its tributaries. These river forces could move quickly to respond to threats or opportunities, and they played crucial roles in many of Mali's military campaigns. The empire's naval capabilities also supported its commercial activities by protecting merchant vessels and maintaining navigation channels. The legal system that governed Mali reflected the empire's diverse cultural heritage and its position at the crossroads of different legal traditions. Islamic law provided the framework for commercial transactions and many civil matters, particularly in urban areas with significant Muslim populations. Traditional African law continued to govern family relationships, property rights, and community disputes in rural areas. Mali's rulers developed innovative approaches to resolving conflicts between different legal systems. They established courts that could apply different types of law depending on the circumstances of each case and the backgrounds of the people involved. They also created appeal processes that allowed dissatisfied parties to seek review of local decisions by higher authorities. The empire's commercial law was particularly advanced, reflecting the complexity and volume of Mali's trade relationships. Standard contracts governed various types of business activities, from caravan expeditions to mining operations to agricultural ventures. These contracts specified the rights and obligations of all parties and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise. Mali's educational system combined traditional African knowledge with Islamic scholarship in ways that created new forms of learning and cultural expression. The empire's schools taught Arabic literacy and Islamic theology, but they also preserved and transmitted traditional histories, laws, and cultural practices through oral instruction. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu became one of the most important centers of learning in the medieval world. This institution attracted scholars and students from across Africa and the Middle East who came to study law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, and other subjects. The university's library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, making it one of the largest collections of written knowledge in the world at that time. Women in Mali society occupied complex positions that reflected both Islamic influences and traditional African customs. Elite women, particularly those connected to the royal family, could wield considerable political and economic power. Some served as advisors to rulers or managed important trade relationships. Queen mothers held special ceremonial roles and were often consulted on matters of succession and governance. Ordinary women participated actively in Mali's economic life. They worked in agriculture, crafts production, and local trade. In market towns, women often operated small businesses and played important roles in local commercial networks. Some women became wealthy through their own efforts and could afford to sponsor religious or cultural activities. Marriage customs in Mali varied according to social class and regional traditions. but they generally reflected the empire's diverse cultural heritage. Elite families arranged marriages to strengthen political alliances and consolidate wealth, while ordinary people had more freedom to choose their own partners. Islamic marriage laws coexisted with traditional customs, creating complex but flexible systems for governing family relationships. Religious life in Mali was characterized by the same tolerance and diversity that marked other aspects of imperial culture. Islam was the official religion of the royal court and was widely practiced among merchants and urban dwellers. However, traditional African religions continued to flourish, particularly in rural areas and among non-Muslim ethnic groups. Many people in Mali practiced syncretic forms of religion that combined Islamic and traditional elements. They might pray in mosques on Fridays, while also participating in traditional ceremonies honoring ancestors or nature spirits. This religious flexibility helped maintain social harmony and prevented the kind of religious conflicts that had contributed to Ghana's decline. Mali's cultural achievements reflected the empire's wealth, diversity, and international connections. Artists working in various media created works that combined local traditions with influences from across Africa and the Islamic world. Metalworkers, textile producers, sculptors, and other craftsmen developed distinctive styles that were both recognizably African and uniquely Mali. Music and oral literature flourished under Mali's patronage. Professional griots preserved and performed epic stories, historical accounts, and praise songs that celebrated the empire's achievements and transmitted cultural values to new generations. These performances were not just entertainment, but vital mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion and cultural identity across Mali's vast and diverse territory. The architectural legacy of Mali can still be seen today in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style that developed during the empire's golden age. This architectural tradition combined local building techniques with Islamic influences to create structures that were both functional and beautiful. The Great Mosque of Djenné, though rebuilt several times since the Mali period, represents the pinnacle of this architectural style. Mali's influence extended far beyond its political boundaries through trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic contacts. The empire's merchants established communities in cities across Africa and the Middle East, spreading Mali's cultural influences while bringing new ideas and technologies back home. Mali's diplomatic missions reached as far as Egypt, Morocco, and the Ottoman Empire, establishing relationships that benefited the empire for generations. The empire's reputation for wealth and stability attracted immigrants from across the known world. Scholars, merchants, craftsmen, and others came to Mali seeking opportunities that might not be available in their homelands. This influx of talent and knowledge contributed to Mali's continued growth and development, while making the empire's culture increasingly cosmopolitan and sophisticated. Trade routes during Mali's peak period connected the empire to markets and suppliers from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, and from the Mediterranean to the forests of Central Africa. Mali's merchants could obtain goods from virtually anywhere in the known world, while Mali's products, particularly gold, were in demand everywhere. This extensive trade network made Mali one of the most internationally connected societies of its time. The agricultural systems that supported Mali's large population were more advanced than those of any previous West African empire. Farmers developed sophisticated irrigation techniques that allowed them to cultivate crops even during dry seasons. They practiced crop rotation and intercropping methods that maintained soil fertility while maximizing production. These agricultural innovations supported population growth and urbanization on an unprecedented scale. Mali's mineral wealth extended beyond gold to include copper, iron, and salt deposits that provided both raw materials for local industries and valuable exports for international trade. The empire's control over these resources gave it significant economic advantages and made it an attractive partner for foreign merchants and governments. Transportation networks throughout Mali were more extensive and better maintained than those of any previous African empire. Well-constructed roads connected major cities and facilitated the movement of armies, administrators, and trade goods. River transport along the Niger and its tributaries provided additional capacity for bulk goods and passengers. These transportation systems were crucial to maintaining unity and prosperity across Mali's vast territory. The communication systems that held Mali together were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Professional messengers carried official correspondence along established routes, while merchants and travelers provided informal channels for news and information. This communication network allowed the central government to stay informed about conditions throughout the empire and to respond quickly to threats or opportunities. As Mali reached its peak during the 14th century, it had become the largest and wealthiest empire in the world at that time. Its territory stretched over an area larger than Western Europe. Its population numbered in the millions, and its wealth was legendary throughout the known world. Mali had succeeded where Ghana had failed, by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential elements that made empire possible in medieval West Africa. But like Ghana before it, Mali would eventually face challenges that would test its resilience and ultimately lead to its decline. The very success that had made Mali great would create new problems and opportunities that future generations of leaders would struggle to manage. The story of Mali's rise and fall provides crucial insights into the dynamics of empire building and the challenges of governing diverse societies across vast distances in the pre-modern world. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the great caravans crossing the desert under Mali's protection, the magnificent cities rising along the Niger River, and the countless lives touched by this empire's remarkable achievements. The Golden Age of Mali represents one of humanity's great experiments in creating prosperity, order, and cultural flowering through trade, tolerance, and skilled governance across one of the world's most challenging environments. Mali's Golden Age would endure for nearly 2 centuries, but by the late 15th century, the same forces that had toppled Ghana were beginning to threaten this mighty empire as well. The challenge of governing such an enormous territory, with its diverse peoples and competing interests, grew more difficult with each passing generation. Provincial governors, once loyal servants of the central authority, began to develop their own power bases and independent agendas. The empire's very size, which had been a source of strength during its rise, now became a liability. Messages from the capital in Niani could take months to reach distant provinces, and by the time responses arrived, local situations had often changed dramatically. This communication lag created opportunities for ambitious regional leaders to act in their own interests, rather than those of the empire as a whole. Religious tensions also began to complicate Mali's internal politics in ways that earlier rulers had successfully managed to avoid. As Islam spread more widely throughout the empire, particularly among urban populations, some traditional authorities felt their influence waning. Meanwhile, newly converted Muslim nobles sometimes questioned why they should be ruled by emperors whose commitment to Islam they viewed as incomplete or politically motivated. The Songhai people, who lived along the eastern bend of the Niger River, had been incorporated into Mali during the empire's expansion, but they had never fully accepted Malian authority. For generations, they had chafed under imperial rule while maintaining their own distinct cultural identity and political traditions. By the 15th century, they were developing the military and economic strength needed to challenge Mali's dominance. Under the leadership of Soni Ali, who ruled from 1464 to 1492, the Songhai began their transformation from a subordinate province into an independent empire. Sani Ali was a brilliant military commander who understood that the changing political landscape of West Africa offered opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. He built a powerful army and navy that could challenge Mali's forces directly. Sani Ali's military campaigns were marked by both strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. He captured the important trading city of Timbuktu from Mali in 1468, gaining control of one of the most valuable commercial centers in West Africa. This victory was more than just a military triumph. It demonstrated that Mali was no longer invincible and encouraged other groups to challenge imperial authority. The conquest of Timbuktu also gave Songhai access to the trans-Saharan trade routes that had been the foundation of Mali's wealth. Sani Ali understood that controlling these commercial networks was essential to building and maintaining an empire in West Africa. He systematically captured other key trading centers, gradually strangling Mali's economic lifelines. But Sani Ali's success wasn't built on military conquest alone. He proved to be a skilled administrator who could govern the diverse territories he conquered. Unlike some conquerors who ruled through fear and oppression, Sani Ali developed policies that gave local communities reasons to support his rule rather than resist it. The rise of Songhai coincided with other challenges that were weakening Mali's position throughout West Africa. Portuguese explorers had begun establishing trading posts along the Atlantic coast, offering African merchants new commercial opportunities that bypassed the traditional trans-Saharan routes. This coastal trade was still small compared to the Saharan commerce, but it represented a potentially serious threat to the monopolies that had made West African empires wealthy. Environmental changes were also creating difficulties for Mali's agricultural and pastoral communities. Periodic droughts reduced crop yields and forced herders to compete with farmers for increasingly scarce water and grazing land. These ecological pressures created refugee populations that strained the empire's resources while generating social tensions that required constant imperial attention. The succession disputes that had occasionally troubled Mali in the past became more frequent and more destructive as the empire weakened. When strong emperors died, competitions between potential heirs often divided the imperial court into opposing factions. These internal power struggles diverted attention and resources away from external threats, while encouraging provincial governors to support different candidates in hopes of gaining advantages for themselves. By the early 16th century, Mali's control over its eastern territories had effectively collapsed. Songhai forces under Sani Ali and his successor Askia Muhammad had conquered most of the major cities and trade routes that had once been the heart of Mali's commercial empire. What remained of Mali was essentially a rump state controlling only the western portions of its former territory. The final blow to Mali's imperial pretensions came in 1591, when Moroccan forces equipped with firearms crossed the Sahara and conquered the remaining Songhai cities, including Timbuktu and Gao. This Moroccan invasion was motivated partly by the desire to control West African gold mines, but it also reflected the growing importance of gunpowder weapons in African warfare. The Moroccan conquest of the major commercial centers effectively ended the era of the great West African empires that had begun with Ghana nearly 1,000 years earlier. While various local kingdoms continued to exist throughout the region, none would ever again achieve the size, wealth, and international influence that had characterized Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The decline and fall of these empires marked a turning point in African history. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had been the foundation of West African wealth and power were gradually superseded by Atlantic commerce controlled by European maritime powers. The political focus of the region shifted from the interior toward the coast, where new kingdoms arose to participate in the growing slave trade and other forms of Atlantic commerce. Yet the legacy of the great West African empires continued to influence the region's development long after their political power had ended. The trade networks they had established, the urban centers they had built, and the cultural traditions they had fostered provided foundations for later developments. The administrative techniques, legal systems, and diplomatic practices they had developed influenced how subsequent African societies organized themselves. The Islamic scholarship that had flourished in cities like Timbuktu and Jenne during the imperial period preserved knowledge and learning that would later contribute to intellectual movements throughout Africa and the Islamic world. The manuscripts collected in these cities contain not only religious and legal texts, but also works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other subjects that represented the accumulated wisdom of medieval Islamic civilization. The architectural traditions developed during the imperial period continued to influence building styles throughout West Africa. The distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architecture that had emerged during Mali's Golden Age became the standard for mosque and palace construction across the region. These building techniques were adapted to local conditions and materials while maintaining their essential characteristics. The cultural synthesis that had occurred in the imperial cities, where African, Arab, and Berber traditions had blended to create new forms of art, music, and literature, continued to evolve even after the empires had fallen. The griots, who had preserved the oral histories of the empires, carried these traditions to new patrons and audiences, ensuring that the stories of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai would survive even when their political power had ended. The economic innovations developed during the imperial period, including sophisticated banking systems, standardized weights and measures, and complex commercial law, influenced trade practices throughout West Africa and beyond. Merchants who had learned their skills in the imperial markets carried these techniques to new trading centers, spreading commercial knowledge across the continent. The political ideas that had emerged during the imperial period, particularly concepts about the relationship between rulers and subjects, the rights of different ethnic groups, and the importance of religious tolerance, continued to influence African political thought. These ideas would later be adapted to new circumstances and would play roles in the development of modern African nations. The military innovations pioneered by the empires, including new forms of organization, tactics, and weaponry, spread throughout Africa and influenced the development of armies in many different regions. The professional military systems developed by Mali and Songhai served as models for later African kingdoms that sought to build effective armed forces. The diplomatic traditions established by the empires, including concepts about international law, treaty making, and diplomatic immunity, influenced how African societies conducted their external relationships. These traditions were particularly important in the coastal regions, where African kingdoms had to negotiate with European trading companies and colonial governments. As the memory of the great empires faded into legend, their stories were preserved and transmitted through oral traditions that would eventually be recorded by modern scholars. These epic narratives, particularly the story of Sundiata's founding of Mali, became central to West African cultural identity and continue to be told and retold today. The archaeological remains of the imperial cities provide tangible evidence of the wealth and sophistication these societies had achieved. Excavations at sites like Koumbi Saleh, Niani, and Gao have revealed impressive architecture, sophisticated urban planning, and extensive trade connections that confirm the accounts of medieval chroniclers. The impact of the West African empires extended far beyond the continent itself. The gold that flowed from their territories helped finance the development of medieval Europe and the Islamic world. The knowledge preserved in their libraries contributed to intellectual developments across Africa and the Middle East. The diplomatic relationships they maintained influenced international politics from Morocco to Egypt. Modern Ghana, Mali, and other West African nations have drawn inspiration from these ancient empires as they've worked to build independent, prosperous societies. The names of the empires have been adopted by modern countries, while their symbols and stories have become important elements of contemporary African identity. The story of these empires also provides important lessons about the dynamics of power, wealth, and cultural development that remain relevant today. Their rise and fall illustrates how geographic advantages, technological innovations, and skilled leadership can create prosperity and influence, while also showing how changing circumstances can undermine even the most successful societies. The religious tolerance that characterized these empires offers valuable insights for modern societies struggling with diversity and pluralism. The way they managed to incorporate different ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions into unified political structures provides examples of successful approaches to nation-building in diverse societies. The economic systems they developed, based on long-distance trade, specialized production, and financial innovation, demonstrate how African societies participated in and helped shape global economic networks centuries before the modern era. Their achievements challenge stereotypes about African capabilities and show how the continent has always been connected to broader patterns of world development. The educational and intellectual traditions they fostered remind us that Africa has always been home to sophisticated learning and scholarship. The universities and libraries they established were among the most advanced in the medieval world and contributed significantly to human knowledge and cultural development. As you continue your journey into sleep, let your mind wander through the vast landscapes where these empires once flourished. Imagine the caravans still crossing the desert, their bells echoing across the dunes. Picture the great cities with their bustling markets, magnificent mosques, and centers of learning where scholars from around the world gathered to study and debate. Feel the weight of gold passing through countless hands, the precious metal that funded not just luxury and power, but also art, architecture, scholarship, and the peaceful exchange of ideas between distant cultures. Sense the rhythm of daily life in these ancient cities, where merchants haggled in multiple languages, where students copied manuscripts by lamplight, where craftsmen created beautiful objects that would be treasured across continents. The empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were more than just political entities. They were crucibles of human creativity and achievement. They showed what was possible when favorable circumstances, human ingenuity, and wise leadership combined to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Their stories remind us that greatness can emerge from any part of the world, that Africa has always been home to sophisticated civilizations, and that the human capacity for building remarkable societies knows no geographic or cultural boundaries. In the gentle darkness of sleep, these ancient voices still whisper their stories across the centuries. The griots still sing their epic tales. The merchants still call out their wares in crowded marketplaces, and the golden caravans still make their stately progress across the eternal sands. The Ghana Empire, the first and perhaps most mysterious of these great West African civilizations, continues to cast its spell across time, reminding us of the golden age when Africa stood at the center of the medieval world. The legacy of Ghana lives on, not just in history books and archaeological sites, but in the enduring human dream of creating societies that are both prosperous and just, both powerful and wise. As sleep carries you deeper into the realm of dreams, you become part of this continuing story, a witness to the eternal human struggle to build something beautiful and lasting in our brief time on this earth. Rest now comes easily as the golden threads of Ghana's story weave through your consciousness. But this tale of West African grandeur is far from over. The empire's influence rippled outward like stones cast into still water, touching civilizations and cultures in ways that would echo through the centuries. Even as political power shifted and trade routes evolved, the foundations Ghana had laid would support the rise of new empires, each building upon the lessons learned from this first great experiment in African state building. The transformation didn't happen overnight. As Ghana's central authority weakened during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the vast network of relationships the empire had cultivated began to reshape itself into new configurations. Provincial governors who had once answered to the emperor in Koumbi Saleh found themselves making increasingly independent decisions. Some declared outright independence, establishing their own kingdoms from the fragments of imperial territory. Others maintained nominal allegiance to Ghana while effectively governing as autonomous rulers. This fragmentation created a complex political landscape across West Africa. Where once a single authority had controlled the flow of gold and salt across the region, now dozens of smaller kingdoms competed for influence and resources. Some of these successor states were remarkably successful in their own right, managing to preserve elements of Ghana's administrative sophistication while adapting to new circumstances and challenges. The Kingdom of Soso emerged as one of the most significant powers in this post-Ghana era, under the leadership of Sumanguru, a formidable warrior king whose reputation for both military prowess and mystical power spread throughout the region. Soso attempted to recreate Ghana's empire under new management. Sumanguru understood that controlling the gold trade remained the key to power in West Africa, and he systematically conquered territories that had once paid tribute to Ghana's emperors. Sumanguru's approach to governance differed markedly from Ghana's traditional methods. Where Ghana's rulers had generally maintained religious tolerance and worked through existing local authority structures, Sumanguru imposed a more centralized and autocratic system. He demanded absolute submission from conquered peoples and showed little patience for the delicate balance of interests that had characterized Ghana's administration. This harsh approach generated resistance that would ultimately prove fatal to Sumanguru's ambitions. Traditional religious authorities, local chiefs, and common people alike chafed under his oppressive rule. The very success that had made Ghana great, its ability to accommodate diversity and manage competing interests, was precisely what Sumanguru's regime lacked. Into this turbulent landscape stepped a young prince whose story would become the stuff of legend. Sundiata Keita, heir to a small kingdom that had fallen under Soso control, would emerge from exile to challenge Sumanguru's dominance and establish an empire that would surpass even Ghana in size, wealth, and international influence. The epic of Sundiata, preserved and transmitted by generations of griots, tells us that this future emperor began life as an unlikely hero. According to the oral traditions that have preserved his story for over 7 centuries, Sundiata was born with physical disabilities that made many dismiss him as a potential leader. His father's death while Sundiata was still young left him vulnerable to political rivals who forced him and his mother into exile. For years, they wandered from court to court, dependent on the charity of distant relatives and foreign rulers. This experience of powerlessness and displacement gave Sundiata a unique perspective on leadership and governance. He learned what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be at the mercy of others' decisions, to watch injustice unfold without having the power to intervene. These lessons would profoundly influence how he later built and governed his own empire. Exile also provided Sundiata with opportunities he might never have had if he had remained safely in his homeland. He traveled widely throughout West Africa, learning about different cultures, political systems, and military techniques. He formed alliances with other displaced nobles and refugees who shared his desire to challenge Sumanguru's oppressive rule. Most importantly, he developed the diplomatic and leadership skills that would eventually enable him to unite a diverse coalition against the Soso king. The epic tells us that Sundiata eventually overcame his physical limitations through determination and spiritual intervention. Whether this transformation was literal or metaphorical, it clearly represents his evolution from a powerless exile into a charismatic leader capable of inspiring others to follow him into battle against seemingly impossible odds. The turning point came when Sundiata and his allies decided they could no longer tolerate Sumanguru's harsh rule. The Soso king had made too many enemies through his cruelty and arrogance. He had alienated traditional religious authorities by trying to suppress ancient customs and beliefs. He had imposed heavy taxes that impoverished local communities. Most dangerously, he had failed to maintain the delicate balance of interests that was necessary to govern such a diverse region successfully. Sundiata's coalition represented something genuinely new in West African politics. Unlike previous conquerors who had relied primarily on military force and the support of their own ethnic groups, Sundiata built his movement around shared grievances and common interests that transcended traditional boundaries. His army included Mandinka warriors from his own people, but it also incorporated fighters from many other groups who had suffered under Soso rule. The decisive battle between Sundiata and Sumanguru took place at Kirina around 1235. The epic describes this confrontation in mythological terms, with both leaders using supernatural powers and magical allies to gain advantage over their enemies. While we cannot take these elements literally, they reflect the very real sense that this battle would determine the future of West Africa. Sundiata's victory at Kirina was more than just a military triumph. It represented the victory of a new approach to governance that would shape West African politics for centuries to come. Rather than simply replacing one autocratic ruler with another, Sundiata established a political system that recognized the rights and interests of different groups within his expanding territory. The Mali Empire that emerged from Sundiata's conquests was built on foundations that Ghana had established, but it was also something genuinely innovative. Mali controlled the same basic trade routes that had made Ghana wealthy, but it expanded them to cover a much larger area. Mali's merchants traded not just across the Sahara, but also along the Atlantic coast and deep into the forest regions of West and Central Africa. Mali also inherited Ghana's role as a mediator between different religious and cultural traditions, but it handled this challenge more successfully than its predecessor had managed in its final centuries. The Mali rulers converted to Islam relatively early in the empire's history, which gave them credibility with North African trading partners and access to the broader Islamic commercial and intellectual networks. However, they maintained tolerant policies toward traditional African religions and allowed local communities to preserve their customary practices. This religious flexibility was crucial to Mali's success because the empire was even more diverse than Ghana had been. Mali stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Bend of the Niger River, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions. Managing this diversity required sophisticated diplomatic skills and a willingness to compromise that not all rulers possessed. The administrative system that governed Mali represented a significant advance over anything Ghana had developed. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an appointed official who reported directly to the emperor. These provincial governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and implementing imperial policies within their territories. However, unlike Sumanguru's harsh centralization, Mali's system incorporated existing local authority structures rather than trying to replace them entirely. Traditional chiefs and community leaders retained significant autonomy as long as they acknowledged Mali's supremacy and fulfilled their obligations to the imperial government. This flexible approach to governance allowed Mali to expand rapidly, while minimizing resistance from conquered populations. Local communities found that life under Mali rule was often better than what they had experienced under previous arrangements. Mali's military was the largest and most professional force that West Africa had ever seen. The empire could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, including cavalry units, infantry formations, and specialized troops trained for different types of warfare. Mali's soldiers were equipped with iron weapons, protective armor, and shields that made them formidable opponents in battle. But Mali's military strength wasn't just about numbers and equipment. The empire's armies were well organized, well supplied, and highly disciplined. They had professional officers who understood tactics and strategy, logistical systems that could support long campaigns, and intelligence networks that provided information about enemy movements and capabilities. This military sophistication allowed Mali to maintain control over its vast territory while continuing to expand its boundaries. Mali also maintained a powerful navy that controlled traffic along the Niger River and its tributaries. These river forces could move quickly to respond to threats or opportunities, and they played crucial roles in many of Mali's military campaigns. The empire's naval capabilities also supported its commercial activities by protecting merchant vessels and maintaining navigation channels. The legal system that governed Mali reflected the empire's diverse cultural heritage and its position at the crossroads of different legal traditions. Islamic law provided the framework for commercial transactions and many civil matters, particularly in urban areas with significant Muslim populations. Traditional African law continued to govern family relationships, property rights, and community disputes in rural areas and among non-Muslim populations. Mali's rulers developed innovative approaches to resolving conflicts between different legal systems. They established courts that could apply different types of law depending on the circumstances of each case and the backgrounds of the people involved. They also created appeal processes that allowed dissatisfied parties to seek review of local decisions by higher authorities. This legal pluralism helped maintain social harmony while respecting the diverse traditions of Mali's many constituent peoples. The empire's commercial law was particularly advanced, reflecting the complexity and volume of Mali's trade relationships. Standard contracts governed various types of business activities, from caravan expeditions to mining operations to agricultural ventures. These contracts specified the rights and obligations of all parties and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise during the course of business relationships. Mali's educational system combined traditional African knowledge with Islamic scholarship in ways that created new forms of learning and cultural expression. The empire's schools taught Arabic literacy and Islamic theology, but they also preserved and transmitted traditional histories, laws, and cultural practices through oral instruction. This educational synthesis produced graduates who could function effectively in both African and Islamic cultural contexts. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu became one of the most important centers of learning in the medieval world. This institution attracted scholars and students from across Africa and the Middle East who came to study law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other subjects. The university's library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, making it one of the largest collections of written knowledge in the world at that time. These manuscripts covered an extraordinary range of subjects, from religious commentaries and legal treatises to works on science, philosophy, and literature. Many were copied locally by Timbuktu's scribes, while others were imported from centers of learning throughout the Islamic world. The preservation of this knowledge in Timbuktu's libraries represents one of Mali's most significant cultural achievements. The most famous ruler of Mali was Mansa Musa, who reigned during the early 14th century when the empire was at the height of its power and wealth. Mansa Musa's name became synonymous with unimaginable riches, and his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324-1325 made Mali famous throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage reveals both the incredible wealth of Mali and the sophisticated international connections that the empire maintained. When Mansa Musa traveled to Mecca, he didn't go alone. His caravan included thousands of followers, hundreds of camels loaded with trade goods, and so much gold that his generous spending in Cairo and other cities along the route actually caused inflation that lasted for years. This wasn't just an ostentatious display of wealth, though Mansa Musa certainly enjoyed demonstrating his power and prosperity. The pilgrimage served important diplomatic and economic purposes. It announced to the Islamic world that Mali was a major power that deserved respect and recognition. It established trade relationships and diplomatic contacts that would benefit Mali for generations. It also demonstrated Mansa Musa's religious devotion, which enhanced his legitimacy both at home and abroad. Perhaps most importantly, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage put Mali on the map quite literally. Medieval mapmakers began including Mali in their world maps, often depicting Mansa Musa as a powerful king holding a golden orb or nugget. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, one of the most famous medieval maps, shows Mansa Musa seated on a throne in West Africa, with the caption describing him as the richest and most noble king in all the land. Mali's wealth, like Ghana's before it, was built primarily on control of the gold trade. But Mali's gold resources were even more extensive than Ghana's had been. The empire controlled the gold fields of Bambouk that Ghana had dominated, but it also gained access to new sources of gold in Bure and other regions. These gold fields were incredibly productive, and Mali's rulers carefully managed their exploitation to maximize both production and profits. The salt trade remained equally important to Mali's economy. The empire controlled the same salt mines in the Sahara that had enriched Ghana, but Mali also developed new sources of salt and expanded trade networks to reach new markets. The city of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara Desert, became one of the most important salt-producing centers in the world under Mali's control. But Mali's economy was more diversified than Ghana's had been. The empire's merchants traded in copper from mines in the Sahara, ivory from elephant herds in the southern forests, and various other commodities that were in demand across Africa and beyond. Mali also developed significant agricultural production, with the fertile Niger River Valley providing food not just for local consumption, but for export to less productive regions. The capital city of Mali, known as Niani, became one of the great urban centers of the medieval world. Located strategically on the Niger River, Niani served as the political, economic, and cultural heart of the empire. The city's markets attracted merchants from across Africa and the Middle East, while its mosques and schools made it an important center of Islamic learning and cultural exchange. Niani's royal palace complex was described by visitors as a marvel of architecture and decoration. The palace buildings were constructed from local stone and decorated with intricate carvings and metalwork that showcased the finest craftsmanship available in the empire. The throne room could accommodate thousands of visitors during public ceremonies, while private quarters housed the emperor's family and closest advisors in luxury that rivaled the courts of Europe and Asia. The daily life of ordinary people within the Mali Empire varied dramatically depending on their social status, occupation, and location within the vast imperial territory. At the apex of society stood the emperor and his immediate family, who lived in luxury that would have impressed royalty anywhere in the medieval world. The royal compound contained multiple buildings constructed from stone and decorated with precious materials imported from across the known world. Below the royal family came the noble class, which included provincial governors, military commanders, wealthy merchants, and other individuals who held positions of authority within the imperial system. These nobles owned large houses, maintained private retinues of servants and guards, and participated actively in the empire's lucrative trade networks. Many owned substantial numbers of slaves who performed domestic labor and worked in various forms of production. The merchant class formed the dynamic backbone of Mali's economy. These traders, many of whom were Muslim, traveled vast distances carrying goods between different regions and cultures. They lived in special quarters of major cities, organized into communities based on their ethnic origins and religious affiliations. Successful merchants could accumulate enormous wealth, sometimes rivaling that of minor nobles, and they invested their profits in trade expeditions, real estate, and luxury goods. Craftsmen and artisans occupied respected positions in Mali society. Blacksmiths held particularly high status because of their ability to work with iron, a skill that was both economically valuable and spiritually significant in many West African cultures. Goldsmiths, textile workers, leather workers, potters, and other specialists all contributed to the empire's economic prosperity while creating goods that were traded across Africa and beyond. The vast majority of Mali's population consisted of farmers who grew the food that sustained the empire's large urban centers and supported its extensive trade networks. Most of these agricultural workers lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, where they grew millet, sorghum, rice, and other crops suited to the West African climate. Some farmers specialized in cotton production, which supported Mali's thriving textile industry, while others raised cattle, goats, and sheep. Women in Mali society occupied complex positions that reflected both Islamic influences and traditional African customs. Elite women, particularly those connected to the royal family, could wield considerable political and economic power. Some served as advisors to rulers or managed important trade relationships. Queen mothers held special ceremonial roles and were often consulted on matters of succession and governance. Ordinary women participated actively in Mali's economic life. They worked in agriculture, crafts production, and local trade networks. In market towns, women often operated small businesses and played important roles in local commercial activities. Some women became wealthy through their own efforts and could afford to sponsor religious or cultural activities. Marriage customs in Mali varied according to social class and regional traditions, but they generally reflected the empire's diverse cultural heritage. Elite families arranged marriages to strengthen political alliances and consolidate wealth, while ordinary people had more freedom to choose their own partners. Islamic marriage laws coexisted with traditional customs, creating complex but flexible systems for governing family relationships. Religious life in Mali was characterized by the same tolerance and diversity that marked other aspects of imperial culture. Islam was the official religion of the royal court and was widely practiced among merchants and urban dwellers. However, traditional African religions continued to flourish, particularly in rural areas and among non-Muslim ethnic groups. Many people in Mali practiced syncretic forms of religion that combined Islamic and traditional elements. They might pray in mosques on Fridays, while also participating in traditional ceremonies honoring ancestors or nature spirits. This religious flexibility helped maintain social harmony and prevented the kind of religious conflicts that had contributed to Ghana's decline. Mali's cultural achievements reflected the empire's wealth, diversity, and international connections. Artists working in various media created works that combined local traditions with influences from across Africa and the Islamic world. Metalworkers, textile producers, sculptors, and other craftsmen developed distinctive styles that were both recognizably African and uniquely Malian. music and oral literature flourished under Mali's patronage. Professional griots preserved and performed epic stories, historical accounts, and praise songs that celebrated the empire's achievements and transmitted cultural values to new generations. These performances were not just entertainment, but vital mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion and cultural identity across Mali's vast and diverse territory. The architectural legacy of Mali can still be seen today in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style that developed during the empire's golden age. This architectural tradition combined local building techniques with Islamic influences to create structures that were both functional and beautiful. The Great Mosque of Djenné, though rebuilt several times since the Mali period, represents the pinnacle of this architectural achievement. Mali's influence extended far beyond its political boundaries through trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic contacts. The empire's merchants established communities in cities across Africa and the Middle East, spreading Mali's cultural influences while bringing new ideas and technologies back home. Mali's diplomatic missions reached as far as Egypt, Morocco, and other major centers of Islamic civilization. As you settle deeper into the realm of dreams, imagine the great caravans still crossing the desert under Mali's protection, their bells echoing across the dunes as they carry the wealth of Africa to distant markets. Picture the magnificent cities rising along the Niger River, where scholars debate in the courtyards of mosques, while merchants from distant lands haggle in bustling marketplaces filled with exotic goods. The story of Mali represents the culmination of West African imperial achievement, building upon Ghana's foundations while reaching heights of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication that would not be equaled again in the region. Yet even this mighty empire would eventually face its own challenges and decline, setting the stage for new powers to emerge and carry forward the torch of African civilization into new eras and territories. But even as Mali reached these unprecedented heights of power and prosperity, the seeds of change were already taking root in the fertile ground of West African politics. Along the great bend of the Niger River, in the ancient city of Gao, a people called the Songhai had been watching and waiting. For generations, they had paid tribute to Mali's emperors, their own kings reduced to vassals in the great imperial hierarchy. Yet beneath this surface submission, the Songhai maintained their own distinct identity, their own ambitions, and their own dreams of greatness. The Songhai were a river people, their entire civilization built around the flowing waters of the Niger. They understood the rhythms of flood and drought, the seasonal patterns that brought life to the vast floodplains of the Middle Niger. Their capital at Gao occupied a strategic position where the great river curved toward the northeast, creating natural harbors and fertile agricultural lands that could support large populations. What made the Songhai particularly formidable was their mastery of river warfare. While other West African peoples focused primarily on land-based military tactics, the Songhai had developed sophisticated naval capabilities that allowed them to move troops and supplies quickly along hundreds of miles of waterways. Their war canoes could appear suddenly at distant points along the river, striking swiftly before disappearing back into the maze of channels and tributaries that they knew better than any foreign invader. This naval expertise became increasingly important as Mali's central authority began to weaken during the 15th century. The vast distances that had once been Mali's strength now became a liability, as communication delays and administrative challenges made it difficult for emperors in distant Niani to respond effectively to local crises. Provincial governors, including the Songhai kings in Gao, found themselves making increasingly independent decisions as they waited months for instructions that might arrive too late to address rapidly changing circumstances. The transformation of the Songhai from loyal vassals to independent power began gradually under a series of ambitious rulers who understood that Mali's apparent strength concealed growing internal weaknesses. They started by asserting greater autonomy in local affairs, collecting taxes and administering justice without seeking approval from Mali's central government. When these actions went unchallenged, they grew bolder, forming alliances with other discontented provincial leaders and building military forces that rivaled those of their supposed overlords. The catalyst for Songhai independence came with the rise of Soni Ali, who became king of the Songhai in 1464. Soni Ali was a military genius whose strategic vision extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Songhai territory. He understood that the changing political landscape of West Africa offered unprecedented opportunities for those bold enough to seize them, and he possessed both the military skills and the political acumen necessary to transform opportunities into lasting achievements. Soni Ali's first major campaign targeted the great commercial city of Timbuktu, which had grown wealthy and powerful under Mali's protection. Timbuktu's location near the Great Bend of the Niger made it a natural meeting point between the river-based commerce of the Sudan and the caravan routes that crossed the Sahara. Control of this city would give the Songhai access to the trans-Saharan trade networks that had been the foundation of Ghana's and Mali's wealth. The siege of Timbuktu in 1468 demonstrated Soni Ali's innovative approach to warfare. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's fortifications, he used his naval forces to cut off Timbuktu's river access, while simultaneously blocking the overland routes that connected the city to its trading partners. This strategy slowly strangled the city's economy while avoiding the heavy casualties that would have resulted from a frontal attack on its defenses. When Timbuktu finally surrendered after months of siege, Soni Ali's treatment of the city revealed both his political sophistication and his sometimes ruthless pragmatism. He executed or exiled the Islamic scholars and religious leaders who had supported Mali, viewing them as potential sources of future resistance. However, he preserved the city's commercial infrastructure and welcomed merchants who were willing to trade under Songhai authority. This selective approach to conquest would become characteristic of Songhai expansion under his rule. The fall of Timbuktu sent shockwaves throughout West Africa. For the first time since Sundiata's victory over Sumanguru 2 centuries earlier, a major commercial center had changed hands through military conquest. The event demonstrated that Mali was no longer invincible and encouraged other groups to challenge imperial authority. More importantly for the Songhai, it provided them with the economic resources necessary to fund further military campaigns. Soni Ali's success at Timbuktu was followed by a systematic campaign to conquer other key points along the Niger River and its tributaries. His forces captured Djenné after a siege lasting 7 years, gaining control of another crucial commercial center. They seized control of the river ports that Mali had used to collect taxes on trade goods moving between different regions. Each victory brought new resources and new opportunities for further expansion. The military innovations that made these conquests possible reflected Soni Ali's understanding that warfare in West Africa was evolving beyond traditional methods. His armies combined the mobility of mounted cavalry with the firepower of newly introduced firearms and the tactical flexibility of professional infantry units. Most importantly, his naval forces gave him strategic advantages that no previous West African ruler had possessed. Soni Ali's war canoes were not simple fishing boats pressed into military service, but specialized vessels designed for combat operations. These ships could carry substantial numbers of warriors along with their equipment and supplies, allowing for rapid deployment of forces across vast distances. They could also transport cavalry horses, enabling combined operations where riverborne forces would land and coordinate with mounted units advancing overland. The psychological impact of these naval operations was as important as their tactical advantages. Enemy forces that were accustomed to fighting land-based campaigns found themselves facing threats from unexpected directions. Cities that had relied on river access for trade and communication discovered that this same access made them vulnerable to Songhai attack. The very waterways that had brought prosperity now brought danger. Soni Ali's approach to governing conquered territories was more pragmatic than ideological. Unlike some conquerors who imposed uniform administrative systems across all their domains, he adapted his methods to local conditions and traditions. In areas with strong Islamic influences, he worked with existing religious and commercial networks. In regions where traditional African customs predominated, he incorporated local chiefs and spiritual leaders into his administrative structure. This flexibility extended to religious matters as well. Although Soni Ali claimed to be a Muslim, his version of Islam incorporated many traditional African elements that Orthodox scholars found problematic. He participated in traditional ceremonies honoring ancestral spirits and nature deities, practices that some Muslims viewed as incompatible with monotheistic faith. This religious syncretism helped him maintain support among diverse populations, but created tensions with Islamic authorities that would have lasting consequences. The rapid expansion of Songhai territory under Soni Ali created new challenges that required innovative solutions. The empire now stretched over hundreds of miles along the Niger River, encompassing territories with different languages, customs, and economic systems. Managing this diversity while maintaining military readiness for further campaigns demanded administrative skills that matched Soni Ali's military genius. The solution lay in developing a decentralized system that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Soni Ali appointed governors to oversee major regions, but these officials were chosen for their local knowledge and existing relationships, rather than their loyalty to Songhai traditions. Provincial administrators were expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and provide military support when requested, but they retained considerable freedom in managing day-to-day affairs. This administrative approach was supported by an extensive intelligence network that kept the central government informed about conditions throughout the empire. Merchants, travelers, and religious figures all served as informal sources of information, while professional messengers maintained regular communication between the capital and distant provinces. This system allowed Soni Ali to respond quickly to threats or opportunities while avoiding the communication delays that had plagued Mali's later years. The economic foundation of the expanding Songhai Empire rested on the same trans-Saharan trade networks that had enriched Ghana and Mali. But Soni Ali's control of the Niger River added new dimensions to commercial activity. River transport was faster and cheaper than overland caravan routes for many types of goods, particularly bulk commodities like grain, salt, and building materials. The Songhai Navy protected merchant vessels while also collecting taxes on commercial traffic. Salt remained one of the most important trade commodities, and Songhai control of the river routes gave them new advantages in this lucrative market. Salt from the Saharan mines could be transported by caravan to river ports, then shipped downstream to markets throughout the Sudan. This river transport reduced costs and allowed Songhai merchants to offer competitive prices while still generating substantial profits for the imperial treasury. Gold continued to flow from the forest regions in the south, but the Songhai developed new trading relationships that bypassed some of the traditional intermediaries. Rather than relying entirely on established caravan routes, they used their naval capabilities to reach gold-producing areas directly via river transport. This innovation reduced costs and increased profits, while also providing alternative supply routes that were less vulnerable to disruption by hostile forces. The cultural life of the Songhai Empire reflected its position at the crossroads of different traditions and influences. The royal court at Gao maintained many traditional African customs, while also adopting Islamic practices that facilitated relationships with North African trading partners. This cultural synthesis created new forms of art, music, and literature that combined elements from diverse sources. Architecture during the Songhai period showed particular innovation in adapting building techniques to the empire's riverine environment. Palaces and mosques in Gao featured elaborate facades that could be seen from the river, serving both aesthetic and political purposes. These buildings announced the wealth and power of their occupants, while also demonstrating the sophisticated craftsmanship available within the empire. The reign of Sani Ali came to an end in 1492 when he died during a military campaign, possibly from drowning when his boat capsized in the Niger River. His death created a succession crisis that would ultimately transform the character of the Songhai Empire. Sani Ali's son, Sani Baru, inherited the throne, but his rule was challenged by one of his father's most capable generals, Muhammad Touré, who would later take the title Askia Muhammad. The conflict between Sani Baru and Muhammad Touré was more than a simple power struggle between ambitious individuals. It represented a fundamental disagreement about the future direction of the empire. Sani Baru sought to continue his father's policies of religious syncretism and accommodation with traditional African customs. Muhammad Touré, by contrast, advocated for a more orthodox Islamic approach that would align the empire more closely with the broader Islamic world. Muhammad Touré's victory in this civil war, achieved through superior military organization and broader political support, marked the beginning of a new phase in Songhai history. Taking the title Askia Muhammad, he would rule for over 30 years and transform the empire into the largest and most powerful state in West African history. His reforms touched every aspect of imperial life, from military organization to legal systems to commercial practices. The Askia dynasty, established by Muhammad Touré, would govern the Songhai Empire through its golden age, a period when Timbuktu and other cities reached new heights of commercial prosperity and intellectual achievement. The University of Sankore attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, while the city's markets hosted merchants from as far away as Cairo and Constantinople. This was the era when Songhai truly surpassed the achievements of Ghana and Mali, creating a civilization that impressed visitors from across the known world. Yet even as the Songhai Empire reached these unprecedented heights, new challenges were emerging that would test its resilience in ways that previous West African empires had never faced. Portuguese explorers were establishing trading posts along the Atlantic coast, offering African merchants new commercial opportunities that bypassed traditional trans-Saharan routes. More ominously, the introduction of firearms was beginning to change the nature of African warfare in fundamental ways. The story of Songhai's rise represents the culmination of over 1,000 years of West African imperial development. Building upon the foundations laid by Ghana and refined by Mali, the Songhai created a state that surpassed its predecessors in size, wealth, and cultural achievement. Their mastery of river warfare, their innovative approaches to administration, and their ability to balance different religious and cultural traditions all contributed to their remarkable success. As sleep deepens and carries you further into the realm of dreams, imagine the great war canoes of the Songhai moving silently along the moonlit Niger, their crews alert for any sign of threat or opportunity. Picture the bustling river ports where merchants from distant lands gather to trade their goods, the sound of different languages mixing in the warm night air as deals are struck and fortunes made. Feel the weight of history flowing like the river itself, carrying the accumulated wisdom and achievements of centuries of African civilization toward an uncertain future. The Empire of Songhai stands at the pinnacle of West African achievement, yet already the seeds of change are stirring in the desert winds, bringing new challenges that will test this mighty civilization in ways its founders could never have imagined. The rhythm of the river continues its eternal flow, indifferent to the rise and fall of human ambitions, yet somehow eternal in its own right. The water that flows past Gao tonight has journeyed from distant mountains, carrying with it the stories of all the lands it has touched. Soon it will reach the Atlantic Ocean, where new currents and new possibilities await, just as new chapters in the story of Africa are waiting to unfold. But beneath the surface of Songhai's golden age, subtle changes were reshaping the very foundations upon which West African power had been built for over a millennium. The arrival of Portuguese caravels along the Atlantic coast represented more than just new trading opportunities. It signaled the beginning of a fundamental shift in global commerce that would gradually undermine the trans-Saharan routes that had made empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai possible. At first, these coastal developments seemed distant and irrelevant to the rulers in Gao. The Atlantic trade was small in scale compared to the vast caravans that still crossed the Sahara, carrying gold, salt, and other precious commodities. Portuguese merchants were interested primarily in gold and ivory, goods that West African traders had been exporting for centuries through established northern routes. The new coastal posts appeared to offer additional markets rather than fundamental competition. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, profound transformations were already underway. The Portuguese brought with them not just new trade goods, but new technologies, new ideas about commerce and governance, and most significantly, new weapons that would revolutionize African warfare. The introduction of firearms to West Africa created military advantages for those who could obtain and master them, while simultaneously making traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Askia Muhammad, the great reformer who had transformed Songhai into an orthodox Islamic state, understood better than most the implications of these changing circumstances. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1496, following the famous precedent set by Mali's Mansa Musa nearly 2 centuries earlier, was partly motivated by a desire to understand how the broader Islamic world was adapting to new global realities. During his journey, Askia Muhammad encountered Ottoman officials who spoke of Portuguese activities not just in West Africa, but throughout the Indian Ocean and along the coasts of Asia. The emerging European maritime powers were systematically inserting themselves into established trade networks, gradually shifting the balance of global commerce away from traditional overland routes toward oceanic pathways they could control. This intelligence helped shape Askia Muhammad's domestic policies when he returned to Songhai. He initiated military reforms that incorporated firearm technology while maintaining the traditional strengths of Songhai forces. He expanded diplomatic contacts with North African states, seeking to strengthen ties with established trading partners even as new alternatives emerged. Most importantly, he invested heavily in urban development and educational institutions, recognizing that Songhai's long-term survival would depend on its ability to adapt and innovate. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu reached its zenith during this period, attracting scholars and students from across the Islamic world. The city's libraries contained an estimated 700,000 manuscripts covering subjects ranging from Islamic theology and jurisprudence to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. This represented one of the largest concentrations of written knowledge anywhere in the world at that time, rivaling the great libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. These scholarly achievements were not merely ornamental displays of cultural sophistication. They served practical purposes in maintaining Songhai's commercial and diplomatic relationships across vast distances. educated administrators could conduct correspondence in Arabic with trading partners and government officials throughout North Africa and the Middle East. Legal scholars provided expertise in Islamic commercial law that facilitated complex international transactions. Astronomers and mathematicians contributed to navigation techniques that improved the efficiency and safety of caravan travel. The economic prosperity that supported these cultural achievements rested on Songhai's continued dominance of traditional trade routes, but also on the empire's success in developing new forms of commercial activity. River transport along the Niger and its tributaries had become increasingly sophisticated, with specialized vessels designed for different types of cargo and different seasonal conditions. Agricultural production in the fertile floodplains supported not just local consumption, but also export to regions where environmental conditions were less favorable. Urban manufacturing had developed to remarkable levels of sophistication in cities like Timbuktu, Dna, and Gao. Textile production, metalworking, leather goods, and other crafts generated products that were prized throughout West Africa and beyond. These manufacturing activities created employment for skilled workers, while also generating tax revenue for the imperial government. The social structure of the Songhai Empire reflected both its African heritage and its Islamic identity. At the apex stood the Askia and his immediate family, surrounded by a court that combined traditional African royal customs with Islamic governmental practices. Provincial governors administered distant territories with considerable autonomy, while local chiefs and community leaders maintained authority over daily affairs within their jurisdictions. The merchant class had grown increasingly influential during the empire's golden age. Successful traders accumulated wealth that sometimes rivaled that of provincial governors, and their commercial networks provided informal channels of communication that supplemented official governmental systems. Many merchants had converted to Islam, which facilitated their participation in trans-Saharan trade, but they maintained relationships with non-Muslim communities that were essential for accessing local products and markets. Religious life in Songhai was more uniformly Islamic than had been the case in Ghana or Mali, reflecting Askia Muhammad's reforms and the empire's closer integration with the broader Islamic world. However, this Islamic identity coexisted with traditional African practices that had been reinterpreted rather than abandoned. Local spirits and ancestors were often understood as part of a larger spiritual hierarchy that ultimately derived its authority from Allah, creating a syncretic religious system that satisfied both theological requirements and cultural needs. Women in Songhai society occupied complex positions that reflected the intersection of Islamic law with African customary practices. Elite women could own property, engage in trade, and exercise considerable influence within their households and communities. Some women became renowned scholars, particularly in religious subjects, while others gained recognition as healers, artists, or commercial entrepreneurs. Marriage customs blended Islamic legal requirements with local traditions, creating diverse practices across different regions and social classes. The legal system that governed Songhai combined Islamic jurisprudence with customary African law in ways that varied according to local circumstances and the nature of specific disputes. Islamic courts handled matters related to commercial transactions, inheritance, and criminal law, particularly in urban areas with significant Muslim populations. Traditional authorities continued to adjudicate family disputes, land rights, and community conflicts using customary procedures that had evolved over centuries. This legal pluralism required sophisticated mechanisms for determining which system of law applied to particular cases and how conflicts between different legal traditions should be resolved. Songhai developed appellate procedures that allowed cases to be reviewed by higher authorities when local decisions proved controversial or when different legal systems produced contradictory results. Military organization under the Askia dynasty represented the culmination of centuries of West African military development. The empire maintained professional forces that combined traditional African military traditions with innovations learned from contact with North African and Middle Eastern armies. Cavalry units remained important for rapid movement across open terrain, while infantry formations provided the disciplined firepower necessary for siege warfare and defensive operations. The Songhai Navy continued to be the empire's most distinctive military asset. River forces could deploy rapidly to threatened areas, transport supplies and reinforcements to distant provinces, and control commercial traffic along hundreds of miles of waterways. These naval capabilities gave Songhai strategic advantages that no previous West African empire had possessed, allowing for more effective governance of the empire's vast riverine territories. Firearms technology was gradually integrated into Songhai military systems, though traditional weapons remained important for many types of operations. The empire's metalworkers developed skills in maintaining and repairing imported firearms, while also continuing to produce the spears, swords, and arrows that equipped most soldiers. This technological transition reflected broader patterns of selective adaptation that characterized Songhai's response to changing global circumstances. Administrative systems developed during the Askia period achieved remarkable levels of sophistication for a pre-modern state. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by appointed officials who reported to the central government through regular correspondence and periodic visits to the capital. Tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration all followed standardized procedures that were adapted to local conditions while maintaining overall consistency. Communication networks linking the central government with distant provinces relied on professional messengers who traveled established routes between major cities and administrative centers. These messengers carried not just official correspondence, but also commercial information, news about external developments, and intelligence about potential threats or opportunities. The efficiency of these communication systems was crucial to maintaining unity across Songhai's vast territory. Record-keeping practices had evolved to support the complex administrative requirements of governing such a large and diverse empire. Government offices maintained detailed records of tax assessments, military obligations, legal decisions, and diplomatic correspondence. These written records supplemented the oral traditions that continued to play important roles in preserving historical knowledge and cultural values. Cultural achievements during Songhai's Golden Age reflected the empire's wealth, diversity, and international connections. Architecture reached new levels of sophistication, with buildings that combined functional design with aesthetic beauty. The distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style that had emerged during the Mali period was refined and elaborated, creating structures that were both practical for the local climate and impressive in their visual impact. Artistic production flourished under imperial patronage and commercial prosperity. Metalworkers created intricate jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects using techniques that had been perfected over generations. Textile producers developed new patterns and dyeing methods that made their products sought after throughout West Africa and beyond. Sculptors and carvers created works that adorned palaces, mosques, and wealthy merchants' homes. Music and oral literature continued to evolve, incorporating new influences while maintaining traditional forms and themes. Professional griots adapted their repertoires to include stories about the Askia dynasty and its achievements, while also preserving older traditions about Ghana and Mali. These performances served not just as entertainment, but as mechanisms for transmitting cultural values and historical knowledge across generations and social boundaries. The intellectual life of Songhai's cities attracted attention from scholars throughout the Islamic world. Timbuktu, in particular, became renowned for its libraries, schools, and learned debates. Students came from as far away as Cairo and Baghdad to study with Songhai's scholars, while local intellectuals corresponded with colleagues across Africa and the Middle East. This scholarly activity contributed to broader intellectual developments within Islamic civilization, while also preserving and advancing African traditions of learning. Yet even as Songhai reached these unprecedented heights of achievement, new challenges were emerging that would test the empire's resilience in ways that its rulers could not fully anticipate. The gradual shift in global trade patterns was beginning to reduce the importance of trans-Saharan routes, while the introduction of new military technologies was changing the balance of power throughout West Africa. Perhaps most ominously, the Moroccan Saadi dynasty was developing ambitions that extended far beyond traditional North African boundaries. The discovery of large silver deposits in the Americas had enabled European powers to flood global markets with precious metals, reducing the relative value of West African gold, while simultaneously creating new sources of wealth that could fund military adventures. These global economic changes had profound implications for West African empires, whose wealth and power depended on controlling the flow of gold and other precious commodities. As alternative sources of wealth emerged and new trade routes developed, the strategic advantages that had made Ghana, Mali, and Songhai dominant forces in their regions were gradually being eroded. The Moroccan rulers recognized these changing circumstances as opportunities to expand their own power and influence. They possessed firearms technology that was superior to anything available in West Africa, and they had access to European military advisors who understood modern siege warfare and artillery tactics. Most importantly, they were motivated by both economic ambitions and religious ideology that justified conquest of non-Moroccan territories. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would bring the era of the great West African empires to a dramatic conclusion. The wealth and sophistication that Songhai had achieved through centuries of careful development would soon face its ultimate test against forces that represented fundamentally new approaches to warfare, governance, and economic organization. As you rest in the gentle embrace of sleep, picture the scholars of Timbuktu bent over their manuscripts in the flickering light of oil lamps, carefully copying texts that preserve the wisdom of ages. Imagine the great markets of Gao, where merchants from distant lands gather to exchange goods and stories, their diverse languages creating a symphony of human interaction beneath the starlit African sky. Feel the weight of history flowing like the eternal Niger, carrying the accumulated achievements of 1,000 years toward an uncertain future. The golden age of Songhai represents the pinnacle of what human ingenuity and cooperation could achieve in the medieval world. Yet already, the winds of change are stirring, bringing new challenges that will reshape the very foundations of African civilization. The river continues its ancient journey toward the sea, indifferent to human ambitions, yet somehow eternal in its patient flow. The water that passes Gao tonight has traveled from distant highlands, carrying with it the stories of all the lands it has touched. Soon it will reach the Atlantic, where new currents and new possibilities await, just as new chapters in the story of Africa are preparing to unfold. The twilight of the great West African empires approached like the slow gathering of storm clouds on the horizon. In the imperial palaces of Gao, advisors whispered of troubling reports from the north. Moroccan forces, equipped with weapons that could breach any wall and tactics learned from European military advisors, were massing in the desert oases. The Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur had set his sights on the legendary wealth of the Sudan, dreaming of gold that could fund his own imperial ambitions. The year 1591 would mark the end of an era that had lasted nearly a millennium. A Moroccan army of 4,000 men, including Spanish and Portuguese mercenaries armed with muskets and cannons, crossed the Sahara under the command of Juder Pasha. This force represented something entirely new in West African warfare. Where previous conflicts had been decided by cavalry charges, superior numbers, or control of strategic positions, this invasion brought industrial-age military technology to a region still fighting with traditional weapons. The Songhai forces that met them at the Battle of Tondibi were brave and numerous, but they faced weapons their ancestors could never have imagined. The thunder of cannon fire scattered the finest cavalry in Africa, while disciplined volleys of musket fire cut down warriors whose courage could not overcome technological disadvantage. In a single afternoon, the military supremacy that had sustained West African empires for centuries was shattered forever. Basquiat Ishak II, the last great ruler of Songhai, fled southward as his capital fell to foreign conquerors. Timbuktu, that jewel of medieval learning, opened its gates to Moroccan forces who came not as scholars seeking knowledge, but as soldiers seeking gold. The libraries that had preserved the wisdom of centuries were scattered, their precious manuscripts sold as scrap paper or abandoned to decay in the desert wind. The Moroccan occupation of the great commercial cities marked the effective end of the trans-Saharan trade networks that had sustained West African power for 1,000 years. The new rulers were interested primarily in extracting wealth rather than maintaining the delicate commercial relationships that had made the region prosperous. Without the careful diplomacy and cultural tolerance that had characterized the great empires, trade networks collapsed and urban centers declined. Yet the fall of Songhai was not simply a story of military conquest. It represented the collision of different worlds, different ways of organizing society and understanding power. The Moroccans brought with them not just superior weapons, but also different concepts of governance, commerce, and cultural identity that were fundamentally incompatible with the traditions that had sustained West African civilization. The scattered remnants of the Songhai Empire fragmented into numerous smaller kingdoms and chieftaincies, each struggling to maintain some semblance of the prosperity and order that had once characterized the region. Some rulers attempted to reconstruct the old trade networks on a smaller scale. Others turned their attention to new forms of commerce, including the growing Atlantic slave trade that was beginning to reshape African societies along the coast. The great cities that had once been centers of learning and commerce gradually declined as their economic foundations crumbled. Timbuktu, which had hosted scholars from across the Islamic world, became a provincial town whose former glory lived on only in memory and legend. Gao, the proud capital of the Songhai Empire, shrank to a fraction of its former size as trade routes shifted and administrative functions disappeared. The cultural achievements of the great empires did not vanish entirely with their political collapse. The architectural traditions, artistic techniques, and scholarly methods that had developed over centuries continued to influence West African societies long after the empires themselves had fallen. Griots preserved the epic stories of Sundiata, Mansa Musa, and the great Askias, ensuring that these tales of African achievement would survive even when the political structures they celebrated had crumbled. The legal systems, administrative practices, and diplomatic traditions developed by Ghana, Mali, and Songhai provided models for later African societies attempting to organize themselves in the face of new challenges. The emphasis on religious tolerance, cultural diversity, and commercial cooperation that had characterized these empires established precedents that would influence African political thought for generations to come. The economic innovations pioneered by the great empires, including sophisticated banking systems, standardized currencies, and complex commercial law, spread throughout Africa and beyond. Merchants who had learned their skills in the imperial markets carried these techniques to new trading centers, ensuring that the commercial wisdom of the empires would outlive their political power. The educational traditions established in cities like Timbuktu continued in various forms even after the original institutions had been destroyed or disrupted. Islamic scholarship remained important throughout West Africa, while traditional systems of knowledge transmission through griots and community elders preserved local customs and historical memories. The synthesis of African and Islamic learning that had characterized the imperial period continued to evolve in new contexts. Women who had gained prominence during the imperial period as merchants, scholars, and political advisors carried their skills and knowledge into the post-imperial era. Their experiences and achievements provided examples for future generations of African women seeking to participate fully in their society's economic, intellectual, and political life. The technological knowledge accumulated during the imperial period, including metallurgy, textile production, architecture, and agricultural techniques, continued to develop and spread throughout West Africa. Craftsmen who had learned their skills in the imperial workshops established new centers of production, while farmers continued to apply the intensive cultivation methods that had supported the empire's large populations. The diplomatic traditions and international connections established by the great empires left lasting legacies in West Africa's relationships with North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The precedents set by rulers like Mansa Musa and Askia Muhammad in conducting international relations provided models for later African leaders navigating the complex world of global politics. As the memory of the great empires gradually transformed from living tradition into historical legend, their stories became powerful symbols of African achievement and potential. The names of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were adopted by modern African nations seeking to connect their contemporary struggles for independence and development with the proud heritage of their medieval predecessors. The archaeological remains of the imperial cities continue to yield new insights into the sophistication and complexity of these ancient African civilizations. Excavations at sites throughout West Africa reveal impressive architecture, sophisticated urban planning, and evidence of extensive trade connections that confirm the accounts of medieval chroniclers and the stories preserved by oral tradition. Modern scholars working to reconstruct the history of the great empires have drawn on Arabic chronicles, oral traditions, archaeological evidence, and comparative studies of other medieval civilizations to create increasingly detailed and nuanced portraits of these remarkable societies. Their research demonstrates that the achievements of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were not isolated phenomena, but part of broader patterns of human development that connected Africa to global networks of trade, learning, and cultural exchange. The story of the great West African empires offers important lessons about the dynamics of power, the importance of adaptability, and the enduring influence of cultural achievement. These civilizations demonstrated that prosperity and sophistication could emerge anywhere that human ingenuity was combined with favorable circumstances and wise leadership. Their rise and fall illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of human ambition in the face of changing global circumstances. The religious tolerance that characterized these empires provides valuable insights for modern societies struggling with diversity and pluralism. The way they managed to incorporate different ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions into unified political structures offers examples of successful approaches to building inclusive societies in diverse environments. The economic systems they developed, based on long-distance trade, specialized production, and financial innovation, demonstrate how African societies participated in and helped shape global economic networks centuries before the modern era. Their achievements challenge stereotypes about African capabilities, while showing how the continent has always been connected to broader patterns of world historical development. The educational and intellectual traditions they fostered remind us that Africa has always been home to sophisticated learning and scholarship. The universities and libraries they established were among the most advanced in the medieval world and contributed significantly to human knowledge and cultural development. As you drift into the deepest realms of sleep, let your consciousness merge with the eternal rhythms of the Sahara, where the wind still carries whispers of ancient caravans and the memory of golden ages. Feel the weight of centuries settling over you, like the gentle accumulation of sand, each grain a moment in the long story of human achievement and aspiration. The great empires have faded into legend, but their spirit lives on in every act of trade conducted with honesty, every dispute resolved through wisdom rather than violence, every scholar who seeks knowledge regardless of its source, and every leader who governs with justice and compassion. In the vast sweep of history, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai shine like stars in the African night, their light still reaching us across the centuries to illuminate the endless human quest for prosperity, knowledge, and meaning. The golden thread that connected these civilizations across time and space continues to weave through the fabric of African experience, binding past to present and present to future in an unbroken chain of memory, hope, and possibility. As sleep carries you beyond the boundaries of time and place, you become part of this continuing story, a witness to the eternal human struggle to build something beautiful and lasting in our brief journey through this world. Rest now in the knowledge that the achievements of these ancient African civilizations continue to inspire and guide us, their legacy living on in every effort to create societies that honor both human dignity and the magnificent diversity of our shared human heritage. The story of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai is not just history, but a continuing invitation to dream, to build, and to reach for greatness in whatever circumstances we find ourselves.